Yes.
So we start with the definition about like what comes out of like get full path name, right? Which is essentially no relative segments. It also does a few other things. They call it in the Windows API behavior comparison piece. Notably that it trims all trailing spaces and periods at the end of the path, if it's like past the final separators or whatever the file name is, and does a few other minor tweaks to internal segments, which is mainly taking off the last dot. That segment of stuff doesn't really apply to the Unix world, and I don't want it to apply. So
right, that's also not part of the definition of absolute path, though. That's additional behavior that get full path currently.
Correct. So like there's additional behavior on Windows on top of absolute path. So absolute path is simply removing those relative segments.
I don't think technically that's not even absolute path. Absolute path just means rooted.
Not with the definitions that we've already used. Documentation for get full path.
Right. That's because get full path normalizes.
No, get full. In what way does it normalize? It doesn't fully normalize.
No, but it normalizes to some extent. It takes out unnecessary dots, unnecessary double dots, unnecessary backslashes, things like that.
So like,
right, it normalizes it. That's not canonicalized, though.
Correct.
It
won't, for instance, like fix casing issues.
Correct.
There's a final path to the last thing. The thing is, like, as far as dot and dot dot are concerned, they're not actual, like, they're not really part of the path. Those are instructions on how to collapse it. If you actually pass that internally to the OS, it wouldn't handle it. Those are always like pulled out before it continues to push it on through.
So is it fair to say that essentially it's fully normalized? In this casing, you literally have to know what.
Correct.
That requires hitting the distance.
Correct, and that's kind of the way that like the general APIs that I've seen so far on Unix too, like the differentiation between the two. Yeah. Like there's get final path on Windows, get final path name that actually does like analyze links and get the casing set up and all this other stuff, and there's similar things on Unix, and I call that up very briefly at the end. And we do probably need that. People have already asked for that in our last design review, that they want to get canonical type thing. The problem with the dots in it is that you can't compare the paths for equivalency, right? If you have like a current or a parent directory, and that's one of the other things you can think about. So
can you really compare with it if they're not canonical?
Yes, I mean if you ignore case on the Windows side and the Unix side, of course, casing always matters.
But there are other things that you could get false negatives, like so you could have two completely different paths and have them actually point to the same file.
Correct, and that's the final path. So there's a logical equivalency, and then there's like for a path for a string, right? Is this the same logical path? How do I compare those? That's the sort of the end you get to with the absolute path. The actual final path includes the links, right, or the symlinks and all that, which is something we don't have right now. That again, people are asking for an entry point into that. So that's something I'll bring up to the table later. Is to get to that next step. We'll try to like keep the documentation on this really explicit about what the differences are between these things.
Does it also take out the 8.3 things?
Yeah, obviously Windows behavior as well. So like there is no alternate name for like this on the Unix side.
But on Unix, aren't there? Do you use tilde for other things like the home directory and stuff like that?
Mm-hmm.
Don't they have like
right? So there's it's this back compatibility thing for 8.3 that's still there, and like we don't even get it quite right. So I talk about that in here a little bit as well. But we try to like the existing code inside Get Full Path. It tries to mimic what Get Full Path name is doing, and doesn't get it right. I call that out at the very end in the last segment, which is the API behavior comparison, which talks about what that actual the Windows API does, and then how Get Full Path differs. There are a few additional checks on there that we try and like prevent you from using global root and like do some checks for like HTTP and a few other things like that. Those are still like legacy behaviors that we can do beyond the trying to normalize the way Windows does. And my intent here is to actually like defer to them modulo these other like blocks that we have in place. We're trying to mimic it ourselves. And also, when we're turning short paths around, even though we don't get that correct right now, we need to keep that behavior. We look at a segment to see like if there's a tilde in the right place, and that's just normal behavior. But the short paths can be anything that like fits into an 8.3. We'll do that same behavior, but like rather than do it as we move forward through the string, we'll move backwards at the end after we've normalized. Because we also need the other contract that we have is that the file doesn't have to exist on disk, right? And that's kind of also falls into this absolute path question, right? So even though we do hit the disk for this 8.3, we totally deal, if we can't find something in that portion of the path, we just keep walking out the path until we do or we don't. And if we don't find anything, then we just don't care. We'll always give you that path back. So if you had a tilde in there and there is no actual path for that, you'll just get that tilde back, right? So that's the way the current behavior works. And it's unfortunate that we have to do that on the Windows side because it does impact the perf, but like I'll do some optimizations around that, and I will still keep it with that like incorrect behavior because getting it correct would actually further hurt perf, right? So I'll also look at the possibility of adding some additional checks in there as well, because like it's not just that it has to be 12 characters with a tilde in it. They have to be DOS valid characters, which is a really limited subset. It's the ASCII set, right? So there may be some opportunities there to cut some of that out as well and avoid it. And that was the second part of the Windows specific piece. So we go to the next page. Continue to only do that. We're going to push it to the end and walk backwards through the string rather than keep doing it repeatedly as we go through. And then, we're going to rely on get full path name, the Windows API, by jamming the path in ourselves. And this is actually what get full path name does itself. It literally just puts the strings together and like it gets current directory in itself. I call that.
I'm sorry if I missed. Why do we want to get the long path?
Huh?
I'm sorry if I missed, but why do we want to get the long path if someone gives us a short path?
Oh, the full path, so you can logical path and see that they're exactly the same, right? So it's canonicalizing from the sense of like getting to a logical full path, right?
Sure, but
and if you have tildes,
normalization like following links or casing.
Well, I think I think there's kind of two questions. It's one, what is the OS representation of this path?
The logical path, not the final path.
Not the final path. And what is the thing that this path points to?
Mm-hmm.
And they're different questions. And the problem is, I don't know if we need the latter API, but we definitely need the former.
The former API is what we have right now. The latter, what?
We don't have that API. It doesn't fix casing issues.
Well, casing is irrelevant in the case of the Windows side of it.
But that's the problem, is that casing, we can't continue. Casing is irrelevant on Windows. It may or may not be relevant on Linux, and then may or versions of a path, which is why we need I think the only sane way to do, if you have to do path comparisons, if you absolutely have to do them, like
the only same way to do it is to like always use case sensitivity yourself, and like which is what you guys have done, I believe, right?
No, we just use ordinal.
That's what I'm saying.
Right.
You're making it case sensitive.
But that only works if there's a way if the user gives me a path.
Correct, and
for me to get the right one.
It's a little tricky to get to, and that's one of the other discussions I'm going to bring up later too. That I have pending was like around the casing problem, because like the current APIs that are out there for getting a case normalized path have nothing to do with the logical path. It's all about the final path. So links are always evaluated. So that's something that we would have to like write significant logic around or get the OSs to actually deal with. And it's sort of similar to what we do with ShortPass. We have to walk through each segment and figure out what the real name of each segment is, and then like it's pretty awkward.
And that's what I was wondering when you were talking about going from short paths to long paths. If that fell into the same bucket.
It technically could, but from a legacy perspective, we haven't done that, and I don't think that that's the right thing to do from a compatibility standpoint to get some of these changes back. But it's likely to introduce more problems if we start normalizing the case.
Well, I meant more in the other direction.
Above and beyond perf, and then you have to hit
Sure.
the disk too.
Yeah.
And that's another thing that takes.
I meant more in the other direction.
If we say why would we not just basically we could have a new API that's basically the equivalent of get final path. If we would do normalization of casing.
Sure, and absolutely. And this is actually on the list of things that people have already asked for that I'm going to.
Always two APIs that get full path and get final path. Right?
So
why would we not move like the long path expansion, for example, only to the final path thing?
Just have it in here. I'm just concerned about compatibility with legacy behavior.
The current behavior is that we do extend those. I know when we go through the extended syntax, that does no longer happen. So if we don't add that, then people may be broken by that.
Yeah, I think it's actually pretty likely that they'll be busted because these actually these slip in a lot of places. There's current behaviors like in the shell and stuff for longer paths where it will turn them into short paths. So strings leak into the system with the short paths and you don't expect it.
I'm not.
With the short file names to be clear that
I've known the short file name in a long time, but the question would be, like, how likely is that? Like, if this is something that is very likely, then I agree that we should have it in the base API. If it's a corner case, then it may be acceptable in some cases to say, well, in order to make perf not suck tremendously,
I just felt that it was like more likely to cause problems. Because again, it's the one sort of like deviancy in this whole API from a purity perspective. But again, it may not be as necessary anymore because we won't be forcing people into this, and there's also a fair amount of talk about stopping doing this stuff altogether. So this whole short.
You have to walk this string anyway, right? So in the common case, if you don't see a tilde, you don't have to go down the.
Correct.
Yeah, that's what it does.
Correct, and that's what it currently does. But it's also incorrect, right? So we're already not meeting the guarantee. Well, it's like because you can call the APIs and you can call it whatever you want. You can set the alternate name.
Oh, sure. Okay.
So, I mean, as long as it fits the character set that DOS uses, which limits it some. But given that's one thing that actually pushes me towards get rid of the damn thing because it's not right anyway. But I hesitate also as well because it's a pretty significant change in behavior, right? As far as because people compare what comes out of these things pretty frequently. And that's really the idea with this is that you can call this and then you can do some path comparisons. As long as you ordinal ignore case and deal with the fact that you have a trailing separator and sort of things, then.
Weren't you also proposing some kind of comparing?
Yes.
API at some point?
Yeah, I just these things are pretty detailed. I didn't want to do them all one. So that is on the backlog too. Things that I want to offer through is there things that will allow you to compare because there are other formats like this with mainly that's around extended pass and there are some additional things I won't go into here, but we need some things to start getting people to consistent and actually get things correct because the corner cases are really broad and easy to stumble into. So not the sort of thing you want everybody to have to figure out by accident, because they're 1 in 10,000 users hit it and then they can't figure out what the heck went wrong because the fallout from those sorts of things is pretty obscure sometimes. So the one difference by relying on Windows instead of doing this is that we trim out trailing spaces and stuff inside the segments. That wouldn't happen anymore, but the only fallout for that is actually on create directory, right? Because create directory does in .NET actually does a recursive create, and the mitigation for this is simply to have create directory when it's creating individual directories, as long as they're not an extended syntax to like do that legacy trimming, so that we don't inadvertently introduce the trailing spaces on names.
Why would it all be create directory to be impacted by this? I'd expect other places to
Create directory is the only one that actually like
walk the segments.
ends up like, well, yeah, actually like does a recursive creation of things with names, right? So that will, everything else, because we trim, that always gets trimmed off the file name, right? And Windows does that as well. The spaces get trimmed off the ending file name. It's only in the case of interior segments. And what that'll let you do too is also let you work with things if they have leaked in through somebody using extended syntax somewhere else, right? So if you get that base, when you get a base path, no longer will we munge it out of like existence, because like you can get a path with a space in it, and it's actually valid. Right now, .NET falls over on that. So now if you're looking at an existing directory, you won't have things fall over for you anymore, right? That's the one thing it'll have. But it'll also keep you from like, if you're still thinking in this legacy file name parsing, then you'll still not create those things, which is actually what we want to do.
For all the other APIs, we basically just forward the entire path down to Windows, and they handle those spaces correctly in the segments.
Well, the spaces are valid in the segments, right? So, and when we get full path, we'll still be doing like the trimming of the periods and things in the segments, because that's the legacy behavior, unless of course you're using extended syntax. And we'll also be doing, and I've already done some of this already in .NET, when we're doing things internally, we'll keep the extended syntax on things so that we don't lose.
Do you know of any like valid scenarios where people would actually rely on that?
Rely on which?
Like, for example, that you can, in certain circumstances, create folders of training spaces. Because it seems like more like, yeah, that's the behavior we have today, but it mostly seems like bugs rather than things that are actually by design.
Oh, that they've come into the system? Yeah. Yes, and that's exactly why I want to like encourage not using the extended syntax, is because like if that's the answer to get to long paths, then those things leak in all over the place, and then it becomes a big issue for legacy code, because you can't deal with these things. I mean, most legacy code things make these sort of assumptions, right? That stuff is normalized out, right? The trailing period, et cetera, et cetera. So your code may work with a max path, but it doesn't work with trailing spaces and the like. So we want to still encourage like formulating paths in that old syntax. So, you know, the extended syntax is an opt-in really, and normally most people should never need to use that.
Yes.
So, and this is actually discussions that we're having internally as well, is that like from solving the overall problem, that like in Windows and the like, that this would be the right thing to do from a compatibility standpoint, instead of continuing to force people down the extended path syntax. So
you're basically saying like we don't require all our customers to prefix paths.
Yep.
Which also gives us the ability to say, well, we don't have to treat it as a don't touch it path, so we can actually still break it apart and normalize individual segments. Which is arguably the more likely breaking point. Yes. for a legacy code. Because again, we talked about the buffer scenario and so on and so forth. It's like, well, okay, you may not be able to hit that long path, but it's worse that you can't hit the paths that are under max path for your legacy code, and that's a problem. So want to avoid that. And I wanted to call that out because that is a change of behavior, and that's one of the things that you'll run into. So, and again, at the very end, the Windows API behavior comparison goes into quite great detail about what get full path does now and what get full path name does, right? And how we break some of those cases. So you can look at that. We won't have enough time to go into that. So I want to get to the extended syntax, which is the next part of that, right? So you're looking at the documentation there on what exactly happens with those things. I've written a few hundred tests for these things to see what actually happens for the Windows API and the like. I mean, I've being internal to Microsoft, of course, I can look at the Windows code as well. So I've also like validated that way as well. So we go back over to the design and other considerations to talk about the extended syntax, which is the Windows specifics, and one more page over to the right. So there we went again. I really hope that
Can they hear? Can they hear so I can talk and like we'll?
Can someone
Can you see
join
if
the meeting?
Steve, can you hear us?
Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Type back to Matt.
Type to me if you can hear us.
Matt Ellis.
Walk towards the light, Steve.
Can somebody join the meeting to see what,
I got it, just a
what
second.
people actually see?
Okay, Steve can still hear us. I don't think we can hear you, Steve, so I will have to be the voice of you.
Up and went away.
How do I join the meeting? You just click the play button. Why isn't there a join button?
Because I don't know.
Because it's play.
Right now it is blank. Oh, that's awesome.
No, it's there.
Is there?
Yeah, it's just a projector that's crashing.
So if I actually
We can't hear it. We'll just let it be and we can talk.
see
And
my cursor moving?
Hold on.
Yeah, let me do this.
Steve can see the cursor, so it seems like you can see the
I just selected a bunch of
same
things.
stuff.
Maybe it's just
is Steve on the Google meeting?
I don't know.
He's probably on both.
Oh god.
Yeah, Steve sees the selected text.
Is he on the Google meeting? So like other people can hear. He's not on the.
He's on the one that Emo sent him, he said.
That's
The link one.
Yeah, it's just a projector that's crashing.
Alright,
Oh.
everything works. Never mind.
It's the light.
We'll just let it be and we can talk.
Alright then.
You've got to shut that off.
Annoying.
Oh, okay. Steve is on the Google meeting, he says.
All right, great. So, sorry we can't hear, but look at the typing. The extended syntax is a little weirder. And I talked about it already in saying like when you use extended syntax, that's the contract with .NET that like you say you know what you're doing, right? You've already resolved the paths. We're not going to do anything with it. Because I mean it is difficult to do, but you'll get significant performance improvements from that if you're like doing things like iterating directories and stuff like that. I mean, we'll try to do that internally as well as much as possible. And you can also get at paths that were impossible before, the trailing spaces and things like that like allow you to deal with those things, particularly if you're file intensive. That allows you also to get access to alternate streams and things like this, right? Some of the more obscure .NET or NTFS stuff. So again, we won't try to get full path name. We'll not check invalid characters, collapse relative segments, or try to follow into alternate short path names. For extended syntax, when you call the overload with the base path, we won't touch the base path other than we still consider the second path to be relative, assuming it is relative, that you didn't pass in a fixed path. Yeah. But if like you have relative segments in there that eat into the base path, fine, they will eat into the base path, but we also won't evaluate the periods in the base path, right? If it's a extended syntax, right? So the normal behavior is to combine things together. So it's saying you don't have extended syntax, pass it on to Windows. That means if the base path actually had relative segments, it would eat those up, and as it works left to right through the string. In this case, we'll start at the end. We'll start analyzing the relative segments ourselves once we get to the end of the base path. So we'll look for the segments that actually have the current and the parent directory.
So it's a mix. So if you have an extended base path, you still do the cleanup and canonicalization of the relative path.
There will be no canonicalization of it other than just the relative segments will be removed. So unfortunately, there's no really great answer for this. I mean, it is possible that we could say, because you don't really know the intent, right? Mm-hmm. And so for sure, so I'm going to say that the intent is what you are saying when you pass in that thing is that you're saying like all you want to do is evaluate the relative segments. Other than that, you know the path is good. So we won't strip out spaces and things like that as well. That's the reason why we want to go that way, even though it's a little awkward to explain.
So the only downside is, I mean, if we use directory.delete, right, or whatever that is, where you actually walk a directory structure and delete files recursively or folders recursively, right? If they have, for example, there is a file or a folder with a training space, then there's no way to delete it from .NET either, because we normalize that space away. You wouldn't find the file
unless you use the directory info and file info classes. So we'll make sure that those things work. And that's actually, we want to encourage people to do that when they're navigating.
Why would those work?
Because they have a handle to the path, right? And you have a file name that comes back from Windows from the find file, and you actually have a your base path already. So we already know what the real path is. And like directory does this as well, right? When you delete recursively, is that it's doing find files and going through there. So that's the change we made. When it's internal like that, we can keep that data and we can make sure we get rid of the right thing. We won't strip it in that case.
But that would mean if you ask us to delete a directory recursively, our implementation needs to do the same thing. Because right now, like
Yeah, it does. It already does delete the hidden ones. I changed that already. So because like again, it's all internal. Like if we're getting a file name back from the system and keeping it inside that directory info or file info classes, that is the path. You know, Windows doesn't lie, right? So I mean, for the file name. So we will keep that file name the way it is. We won't strip that off.
I see.
So as long as you don't go out to where you're back to just a string again, you're fine, right? And calling path get full path. So if you get the full path out and then call delete with that full path, then it's going to go through the normal path get full path normalization. So like probably do a long blog post about it, like the behavior differences with things and like encourage, you know, the best practices for dealing with paths on Windows, right? So because again, these sorts of cases are out there and very easy to run into.
That makes sense. Because I remember there were like issues where team builds, for example, had trouble with actually cleaning the build output because it couldn't delete certain files in it, and
Yep.
then it would just get stuck. And then Windows doesn't like it if you delete the parent folder and still have files in the unexecutable spot, you know. Because I don't think Windows itself does it.
You know, it doesn't do recursive deletion. So like, yeah, you actually have to go through and remove each of the files and like then remove the directories and walk backwards up the tree, which we do. So,
All right.
well, and now we actually remove.
So I have another question around the path combine versus this statement. What would be the difference of just calling path to combine with base path and then passing that to the existing get full path API? Would there be any difference between that scenario and the new API you're?
No, not really. Other than the deferring to the Windows thing that I'm doing is going to change the current behavior.
But wouldn't you still you would get the same?
That would be the same. You would get the same output. Yes, it is really just the same as calling path combine.
So then the question is it worth having this new overload if we have a pretty straightforward way of doing it?
Because of extended paths, we actually have to deal with it that way.
Even with the extended paths, you could do the same thing, right? With the extended paths, you could do
No, because then it would change the behavior of like it would change the behavior of the relative segment, right? So that second part of the path, like normally you get some substring in from something like say like a build system, you're going to get dot whatever. Like if you combine that with the extended syntax like we're talking about as a single path, we won't touch it.
Okay, I thought you were still saying, so with the existing API today, if you pass an extended path, say get full path and just with the full absolute path and it's extended, you're not going to do anything at all? You're not even going to collapse the relative paths in there? I thought you were going to still be doing that.
No, and that's we could do that. And it was erring on the side of like not. But
I mean,
if we do that, we'd have to write it ourselves or like do some.
You always have options that we can say like these are quirks, or we can just say, you know, starting with .NET Framework X1 you just guess that behavior whether you want it or not. And then people are expected to test their apps. Like I mean, I think we need to figure out like how we deal with those things. But
and the other thing he was talking about, the path combine is busted, right? It doesn't deal with SQL
I think.
Right. So.
But I also think the get full path with the two things are busted because you're not assuming the second path is relative because if you can pass the absolute path there too and they're not doing anything, which is a little bit hand-waving at my end too.
Well, again, it's a combination of two APIs. Now, if we change the behavior of combine, then yes, we could potentially do it, and we actually resolve the relative segments but that makes it hard to make a sort of a foundational statement. I mean, we can still do it. We could say like, all right, with extended paths, we won't touch them other than, and have the one caveat. But I want to be very careful about like leaking in too many caveats into what we do when you're passing the extended syntax in. Because like if you're touching that, you're really saying you know what you're doing. It's .NET, stop playing with it because you're breaking me, right?
Yes.
And that's kind of now. Thankfully on the Unix side, and I haven't talked about it much, none of this really comes into play because like there are no the legacy DOS things that they have to deal with.
How does this come into play when we start actually automatically converting the normal strings without the extended paths, the long paths, normal strings, passing them to get full path? And then how are we still going to clean them up the same way? So you have a path that's 1,000 characters long without the extended path. When we start naturally just accepting long paths even on Windows, you're going to behind the scenes you have to convert that to extended path somehow.
No, actually, this is the one API and one of the APIs in Windows that actually has no path length limitation.
Okay. So in that case, if you're not passing the extended path, but it's still a long path, it's going to still do all the normalization.
Yeah, it's a very simple string processing routine. It's a complicated string processing routine. It is just a string processing routine. It does some other things that, like, I'm sure people are busted over. Like, it looks at con and turns it into //period /con, right? You know, there's a bunch of other things that are like not so obvious.
In my mind, I was always thinking of extended syntax as always one-to-one relation with long paths, and we'd be treating them the same behavior. We need to think about extended path as something else. This is like a path I don't want you to manipulate, then that's a different question.
Yeah, that's the difference. So like that's the design is that long paths will work. And then we will also have this other thing to say that, like, if you want .NET not to normalize, use this other syntax, right? And
So you would basically allow customers to pass in // question mark / as a prefix, and then it would basically translate it, don't touch this thing. Right?
Yep.
Including on Unix and Mac?
Well, I mean,
Well-
syntax is OS specific.
Well, it kind of is, but I mean, if it's being used as a marker of don't touch this path.
well, I actually thought about that this morning, and like, I think we should think about that and like see if that really has any value. You know, again, on the Unix world, I'm not so sure that that's as useful. The Windows scenario for like NTFS paths and the like is just so complicated and wacky that, like, and the legacy behavior versus what's actually possible to do are so diverse and broken that, like,
To be clear, like, all the normalization that we do are specific to Windows. Right? Like, on
right.
OS,
Well,
you know.
there's normalization on the Unix side, but it's just removing segments, right?
Yes.
Those relative segments.
Yeah, but what if on the Unix side?
If you haven't put it in bed and all.
But if I don't want to remove those, what's my option on Unix side if I don't
Well,
want
the
to?
question is whether that's actually a scenario. I think the question is,
There is nothing, and because there's only that scenario. That's like why I'm like, well, okay, we can think about it, but I wasn't like, oh yeah, this is really a good idea, because like, how often is
Just
that
trying to figure out how
really,
to make it consistent.
how's that really going to come into play, right? You know, how often does that really happen? And it's really kind of not encouraged anyway, right? I mean, like, even on the Unix side, so many APIs expect that those are relative segments, right? Like, while you can actually name files, whatever, you're asking for trouble.
yeah, like, I remember all the wildcards that you can have as file names, and then you start to do
Yeah.
them, and then we delete every fucking file. Right? I mean, I don't know. To me, it sounds more like I would start it as a Windows-specific thing, and then we can think about what we do on Linux and Mac, because they're both new.
Well, I'd love to hear people's thoughts on it for sure, because
I wish it didn't exist and we never had to do anything with it, but that's a different question.
we didn't have DOS compatibility problems and like, so like, you know, I think this is a great way to like start breaking out of that 40-year history now that we're unfortunately carrying around with us.
All right, so I think we need to wrap up. So I will publish your document and Markdown, and then the notes that I took during the meeting. As far as follow-up, so like, what is the next thing that we will see? Like, I mean, there's probably some more.
So I'll start pulling in those other APIs that I talked about in the last talk as well. It'll be a few weeks before we see another one of those. The .NET implementation for at least the basic support for extended syntax is already in there. It was part of Beta 7. Hopefully in Beta 8 we'll have the implicit support, and probably won't have this API in place by the time Beta 8 rolls around, but that's the expectation. So I would assume in another like 3 weeks, 4 weeks, we'll start talking about the other APIs. I'm going to be out for a week and a half, which is part of the reason why it's going to be a few weeks. But I will be following along with these things, and please give your input.
And thanks, guys, online.